Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine War, update extra video to discuss the counteroffensive, the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and whether it's been successful or not. I don't know really what I'm going to say yet until I've said it. It'll just come out. We're going to start by looking at a Shashank Joshi. He's the defense correspondent for The Economist. We're going to look at one of his threads, and he then refers to a Neil Hauer thread, who is a Russia, Ukraine and Caucasus expert. So he's also written for a number of publications. So what does Neil say first? We'll go into that. Now, I'm going to just couch this in terms of our psychology, to get us to think about that. Many of you will be pro-Ukrainian, as I am, and we want the reality to be the most awesome for Ukraine as it possibly can be. And so therefore, when we are met with data or views that don't align with a really positive outlook, we can react in a number of ways. We can try and shut down those views, we can entrench ourselves, or we can accept them, we can deal with them, we can argue against them, or whatever. Just think about the way that you deal with data that isn't as great as you want it to be, right? Or claims. So just be careful about that in the way that you react. Make sure that you're doing justice to good critical thinking. On the other hand, we can also be really pessimistic and be all doom and gloom, and perhaps we're looking in the wrong place. And I think there's going to be all sorts of things going on with in dealing with this subject, because there were a lot of positive beliefs going into the counteroffensive that Ukrainians have been given a bunch of kit, and that they had half decent trained brigades ready to go, etc., etc. I would say, though, that a lot of the kit didn't actually get delivered quicker. And actually, Zelensky was talking about this, and there were claims that the counteroffensive was delayed because he was waiting for kit. Well, actually, some of that kit, like the Abrams, didn't even get there till the end of September. And they haven't actually been used yet. We didn't get ATACMS being used until very recently. Imagine what would have happened had ATACMS been able to be used at the beginning or before the counteroffensive started. So you could shape the battlefield by taking out helicopter bases so that helicopters couldn't be used to help defend the area, as the Russians, used them really effectively on the front lines in the Zaporizhia region. So there are we could talk a lot, and we will talk a lot about how allies have helped Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine would be absolutely screwed without allied help, but some of that help has been very slow in getting there, and with strings attached, so on and so forth. Anyway, let's go to the stimulus here. Almost 5 months into Ukraine's counteroffensive, with action winding down, I think it's safe to say it's been a serious failure. The overarching goal was to liberate a large amount of territory, including the cities of Tokmak and Melitopol, and this has not happened, he says. There's a lot of people responding to this who don't seem to understand that Ukraine needs to liberate its territory in order to win. There were a ton of resources compiled for this offensive with this goal in mind. It hasn't succeeded. Don't know what else to tell you. The biggest issue is ammunition. There was an enormous amount of artillery ammo, especially bought from South Korea, but also concentrated from other sources, that was put together specifically for this offensive. That's gone now, and very likely won't be replaced for a full year. Ask any Ukrainian serviceman, as I have repeatedly on frontline visits in Donbass and Zaporizhia for the past year and a half, and they will tell you ammo is the biggest issue. They had a lot for this offensive, and it won't be repeated soon, and goals weren't achieved. And let's see what Shashank Joshi says. Neil is correct. Ukraine's offensive has not met its own private or public goals, and it's highly unlikely to do so. The fact that Ukraine is putting impressive pressure on the Black Sea Fleet and inflicting heavy losses on troops and artillery does not change that conclusion. Ukrainian attrition of Russian troops and artillery is not an indication of counteroffensive success, because it's increasingly clear that the rate of attrition, while high, is not high enough to induce a collapse of Russian lines, or a political reassessment. An honest appraisal of Ukraine's counteroffensive is important, because if you don't identify errors and enduring weaknesses, you can't address and rectify them for the future. Ukrainian generals recognize this more than many of Ukraine's most fervent supporters do. And there's lots of pushback to these claims, by the way. So lots of people saying that the criteria, someone here saying, Martin Tutero, saying he didn't use the same criteria when Russia was attacking, but invented ratios to discredit Ukrainian defenses. So, trying to pick holes in Neil Hoyer's reasoning there, so on and so forth. Right. One of my thoughts. My thoughts are that and by the way, I also need to point out, as I think Shashin Joshi says here, that actually one of the generals stated very explicitly, so General Alexander Tarnavsky stated explicitly in September, Tokmak is the minimum goal. So Joshi is saying that if you fail to meet your minimum goal, then that is a failure. So the quote from the article, although someone says that's a misleading quoting there, but the quote is, there's a combination of small harmful enemy defense groups that currently are planted very precisely and competently, he said, but the actions of our fighters force them to slowly pull back when they face our assault squads. The general conceded that the counteroffensive to be a success, Ukrainian forces need to at least reach the city of Tokmak. Tokmak is the minimum goal, he said. The overall objective is to get to our state borders. Despite conceding the advance wasn't going as fast as expected, Tarnavsky said winter would not slow down the counteroffensive. So the pushback from some people is that, yes, while Tokmak was claimed to be the minimum goal, the time frame that Tarnavsky was putting on it was clearly past winter. So despite conceding the advance wasn't going as fast as expected, he said that winter would not slow down the counteroffensive. In other words, a counteroffensive would go through the winter, and you might see an achievement of those goals in, say, spring. And that is indeed very plausible, very possible, and arguably plausible. My opinion is this, right? Originally, the Ukrainians, I think, were setting lofty goals of maybe getting down to the coast and interdicting this highway that goes parallel to the coast down near Primorsk and Berdyansk area. We're doing maybe a number of attacks in a number of places. Maybe 3 prongs. It's Velika Novosilka, Robotyne, and Vasilivka. Perhaps with another later attack across the Dnipro, if this was going well, and they'd have the resources in place, which I think they do have the resources in place, but unfortunately it didn't go as well as was hoped up in the Zaporizhia region. So these guys left down in the Kherson Oblast are thinking, well, do we do it anyway? And I think you're starting to see them try and take advantage of some bridgeheads along there and the lack of Russian resources there compared to other places along the front line. But nonetheless, we've got to November, and we have seen the Ukrainians halt at basically the first major line of defense. Right? They haven't broken that first line of defense in a major way. They have sort of broken it in certain areas, but it's not been a breakthrough where they can get behind and get to the next line or the line behind that, and they certainly haven't got to Tokmak. So in terms of territory gained, you can say if your objective is territory gained, then this has been a failure. Or at least it is still ongoing, and it is certainly not succeeded so far. But it may indeed succeed with an extended time frame. In reality, what happened is that as soon as they started attacking in a serious way, they realized that the Russians had actually spent all that time while the Ukrainians, and it's a really difficult situation. The Ukrainians had to wait to get given the weapons to do the counteroffensive, and all the time they're waiting for the weapons, the Russians were building up the defenses. If they'd gone too early, they would have had nothing to go with, and they wouldn't have had trained up brigades and the equipment and the mechanized equipment to do it. If they did wait and they had that, then they'd come across minefields and defensives that have been hugely built up. The Russians could afford to throw men at the problem and throw men into these defensive lines, and as long as they didn't completely capitulate, it would be fine. They could just attrit away these forces to stop the advance of the Ukrainians. So the Russians succeeded in stopping the advance with minefields, with fortifications and defences, with artillery, and with ATGMs and all those troops I talked about, and also with air advantage. They didn't have air superiority, but they could have helicopters back here firing out of range from ATGM teams with their longer ranged ATGMs of their own from helicopters and taking out equipment. So that all that together meant that the Ukrainians very soon realized they had to change their plans. So you could say at that point that original counteroffensive failed, but that was like within a week. And then it became a new thing where territory wasn't important. So kind of when I look at these kind of claims, my answer, typical kind of philosophical answer is depends how you define your terms. Yeah, you can call it failure if you want, whatever. If you're saying that they need to get to Tokmak by Christmas, then it's failed. And they probably had that objective set out then. They were probably like, right, ideally we need to get to Tokmak or parallel to Tokmak by a certain time, right? Okay, you haven't done that. Okay, you failed. But actually, they changed that within a week or so. The loss of equipment around Malotokmachka meant that they were like, right, we need to change things. And we can start looking at data. So this is Dell's data that he's done. It's linked on every video description I have. So you can always go and check this out. He does it as a kind of open source thing, and it's very kind of him to do that, to take his time doing that. So thank you. But all the caveats apply because these are the general stuff, Ukrainian general stuff figures for the Russian losses. It doesn't tell you the Ukrainian losses, and there will be an element of doubt as to their complete accuracy. Is there propaganda involved? Is there guesstimation involved? But I think the general trends are going to be accurate. Right. What do we have? Well, personnel lost it ticked. It was at its worst for the Russians across a consistent amount of time around this is February, so this is around winter time 2022 to 23, going into spring, and the Russians took their biggest losses there because Bakhmut was happening broadly and other places around the front line, but that was your meat grinder of Bakhmut. And then we start going throughout 2023, we start getting to June, and we start seeing it sort of tick up again. And then this is the change. So this was at the beginning of the counteroffensive, and then it broadly sort of changed, and we started seeing troop losses go down until this last month, where it's been absolutely mental. We've had one day of 1,380 lost. But that, interestingly, wasn't the Ukrainian counteroffensive. That was a Russian attack themselves. So that was the offensive on Avdiivka for the Russians that was responsible for the attrition of most of these troops. What this tells you is that as this number ticks downwards, although this is still, a large number of troops they're losing on a daily, a weekly, and monthly basis, it tells you that the Ukrainians changed what they were doing. And then when we look at tanks lost, we started seeing them go up in June, around the counteroffensive starting, and continue to go upwards, and then spike in the last month. But that last month is again predominantly going to be what's taken place in Avdiivka. Not entirely, though. So what we see is troop losses going marginally sort of downwards, right? But equipment losses starting to go up. Okay, let's look at APVs. These are MRAPs. These are infantry fighting vehicles, APCs. Now, here it's just fairly consistent. We see the counteroffensive start around here, and it marginally goes up. As you can see, the trend line there, that orange dotted line, going upwards, and then you get to October and it goes mental because, again, Avdiivka. So this might suggest that the sorts of vehicles you would see in Russia attacking, or maybe even defending quite a lot, but they're mainly defending in trenches, are being lost at consistent levels, but they're not spiking due to an counteroffensive. And again, you could explain that in terms of any kind of interpretation of the counteroffensive. You wouldn't necessarily expect to see those types of vehicles being lost the most. But as we see, when Russia go on the attack, then they do get lost. Okay, what else? Artillery. Let's look at artillery. Right, okay. Now something is happening here. So as we go into April and then into May, you start seeing, or from April into May, you start seeing a significant increase. This blue line gets steeper. That signifies that the losses are getting much heavier. You're starting to see the heaviest losses of artillery since the war began. You might have certain days previously where they lost more, but actually, no, on a consistent daily to weekly to monthly basis, you can see a clear trend line going upwards. And in fact, recently in the month of October, starting to go back down again, possibly as they are running a bit short of artillery. So there aren't as many artillery pieces to find, to acquire as targets and to hit. But we're seeing artillery become a really significant category of Russian losses, up to losing 48 in one single day in the beginning of October. That's before the Russian attack in Avdiivka. So that tells us something. So, okay, the counteroffensive seemed to then start seeing artillery getting taken out. Now let's go on to multiple launch rocket systems. It's a bit too difficult because there aren't as many of these, so the data is more open to anomalies and it's difficult to see trends. But from the orange dotted line, that's where it's quite useful, is you can see a slight uptick in MLRS lost over the counteroffensive period, right? And I think that's all you can say. In line really with artillery losses, but you're not going to see a huge spike because they just have fewer of them compared to artillery pieces. Then when we come to anti-aircraft warfare systems, again, when we start hitting May, it's April to May, you're starting to see the shaping for the counteroffensive and then the counteroffensive. We're starting to see these getting hit more and more until, maybe in August we see it pop down again as the air defense systems maybe moved back or have been attrited quite a lot themselves. And then aircraft, there's been a number of fixed-wing aircraft lost. Helicopters, interestingly, around the time of the counteroffensive starting, they lost a lot, and that signifies they were using them a lot to defend, and that put them in harm's way, and they lost a lot as well. And then Berdyansk here saw that spike upwards. But there were days when a couple were lost, and many days in a row where one was lost, every day for a number of days. So yeah, helicopters are lost, and I think that shows counteroffensive activity and the usage of helicopters by the Russians in defending against mechanized assaults. And again, we go back to the idea of, wouldn't it be nice if ATACMS would be delivered to Ukraine sooner? And then we come on to vehicles and fuel tanks, and we can see a similar kind of trend upwards during the counteroffensive. So when we go back to this idea of changing their tack, the Ukrainians here saying, right, we lost a bunch of equipment, stop, We're going to continue prodding and probing and trying to take territory. But then this is what I was talking to you about, the different levels of goal. If you're the number one goal at the top is going to be taking back their territory to 1991 status, right? So they want their land back. But in order to get their land back, they realized, I think in that the loss at Malatokmachka, they realized that we aren't going to get our land back until we attrit artillery, MLRS, anti-aircraft warfare system, and logistics, which is exactly what you see from these figures. So the way these figures go, for me, denotes a change in tactics, moving from a land objective to an attritional objective of key bits of equipment. And that's what we see. And we have been going through this process of seeing the Russian defenses being degraded in terms of those key bits of equipment and their logistics. But the thing is, what you want to do is do all of that to then go, right, now we need to revisit the whole Tokmak thing. Now we need to revisit the land objective thing. The question is, when can they do that? Or are they still in the process of doing that? Do they still have intentions to get to Tokmak without having to kind of start again and reconstitute and get other brigades back in and trained and new boots on the ground and so on and so forth? Are they going to do that with the existing capabilities? Or the problem is some of those have been sent up to Avdiivka. So this is Russia trying, and to take Avdiivka, but also causing the Ukrainians to redivert some of their resources, which means they're less able to get to places like Tokmak. So we might still be like right in the middle of this whole extended process to get to Tokmak. If we're going to say Tokmak is the kind of sub-objective. So yeah, take all your land back, attrit air defense, attrit logistics, attrit artillery, all underneath that, get your land back. You can't get your land back until you've done that, because you can't move forward if all these things are in place. And then, under get your land back will be Tokmak, and under Tokmak will be these now. So can they think about Tokmak? Have we got to a point where these categories have been attrited significantly enough? Well, possibly, but then the problem is that has taken 3 months, 4 months to do, and in those 4 months, necessarily your own Ukrainian troops have been attrited. Yes, Russian troops have been attrited at a higher level and a more problematic level for the Russians, but the Ukrainians have been as well, and that might leave them in a position where, well, we've achieved these objectives, but we can no longer commit enough forces to break through these trench lines to take places like Novoprokopivka, Verbove, Ocheretuvate, to then get onto Tokmak to be able to successfully cut the land bridge by fire control over these roads. It's kind of like, so if you were to ask me, has the counteroffensive been a success or a failure, I would be like, it's complicated. The initial goal, it's been a failure, but it was a failure almost straight away, and they had to just reassess and change everything. And it's been a success in terms of degrading key bits of equipment, but in achieving that success, they've unfortunately attrited their personnel and some of their own offensive equipment to the point where I don't know if they're capable of continuing without reconstituting, or whether this is just going to be a slow, gradual grind towards Tokmak. Will the Russians capitulate? I don't know. They seem to have a consistent supply of new boots on the ground. Ukrainians might hope that at some point it all goes wrong back in Russia, and people get upset about sending their relatives to their demise in a foreign country that they don't think is foreign. I don't know. There are all these different games, and all the while Russia, I mean, you could argue that Ukraine, and this is what NATO said, were concentrating in too many places. So you had Vasilivka, you had Velika Novosilka, where they made most of the territorial gains, but actually didn't really reach the trenches, where you've got the decision to attack in the most intensely defended area in the whole of Ukraine. This is where Andrew Perpetua's talked about, I don't know why they attacked at Robotyne, at this area, at Malotokmachka, but they did. You could say that NATO were right in saying, well, actually, you need everything to go in there. There are those arguments. I mean, you can see the amount of territory that Ukraine have gained, because it's from this white line. That's the 30th of May line from Deep State Map. So you've got an area here, some area between Vasilivka and Robotyne. You've got quite a large area in Robotyne, but it's taken a long time. There's certain areas here and there, and then Velika Novosilka area, a little bit around Vuhledar and here and there. But then we start seeing that the Russians have taken some land in certain areas. In Avdiivka, as they're doing a counterattack, we've got this area to the south of Bakhmut that the Ukrainians had a lot of success, and even just to the north of Bakhmut, certain areas as well further to the north and north of Soledar. But then as we come north of there, the Russians have taken large swathes of land off the Ukrainians during the Ukrainian counteroffensive time, in trying to distract the Ukrainians potentially. And you could argue most successfully in Avdiivka, where they've had to bring in some, we've seen Leopards and Bradleys get lost recently around near the slag heap around here, which means that they are bringing up some of their forces from the Zaporizhia region to defend here, which means that the Ukrainians are stretched themselves, which would then indicate that they are less likely to be able to continue advancing at any significant rate in the Robotyne area without having to really think about reconstituting or mobilizing. So I think it's really difficult for the Ukrainians, and I think it was difficult because no one quite predicted how difficult the minefields would be to navigate and how difficult the trench lines would be, and not just the trench lines, but every tree line that has been dug into. And I think that was underestimated. It's so difficult for the Ukrainians to advance if one of your objectives is also not to lose troops. So if you're the Russians, right, if you swap sides here and had the Russians up the north and the Ukrainians down to the south, they just would have piled endless amounts of meat into Robotyne and probably would have taken more land, but because their objectives would not have considered not losing their own troops, whereas one of the key Ukrainian objectives is not to lose their own troops because they have fewer personnel to draw from just as a population, and they value human life more than the Russians. And so with that in mind, they are not going to do the sort of thing that we've seen Russia do in Avdiivka. And that means that they will find it harder to take land, because taking land requires attritionally storming trenches with human beings after navigating gazillions of mines while being pummeled by artillery and ATGMs. It is difficult. So, yeah, to kind of formulate a conclusion, the initial goal they didn't succeed at. Their new goal they have succeeded at in terms of attrition of key bits of equipment and indeed personnel, although most of the personnel has been attrited by the Russians themselves in their Avdiivka attacks. The question is now, I think, is open, because I don't think the Ukrainians are in a position to do much more without reconstituting, but I may be wrong. And the time frame is also open-ended. So have they succeeded? You could answer not yet. They haven't succeeded yet. It's like saying in a football match, it's like Man City are winning a drawing 2-2 with, I don't know, Bayern Munich, right? And you might look at the game at 64 minutes and say, have Manchester City succeeded? And you'd be like, well, no, they haven't succeeded, but there's still like 26 minutes to play the game. All right, yeah, but have they succeeded? No. Well, that means they failed. Well, not really. Like, it's 2-2. Like, they haven't won. I know it's a cup game. They haven't won. but also there's 26 minutes still to go, like I told you. And so when you say have they succeeded, you could answer not yet, but they still might. Or you could say the counteroffensive has effectively ground to a halt and they haven't got to Tokmak, so they've failed, but they succeeded in other ways. And other ways can include logistics, all the categories I've talked about, but also the Black Sea Fleet in this time has moved from Sevastopol predominantly to Novorossiysk. We have seen a pummeling of certain targets with cruise missiles. We've seen ATACMS being used effectively. So there are other metrics of success where this counteroffensive has been a good period for the Ukrainians, but they haven't succeeded in getting to Tokmak. Whether you think that's, a deal breaker or not is up to you. I'll be interested in seeing what you have to think about this. Hopefully this was of some use, or maybe it even clouded your conclusions even more. Anyway, take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.